afternoon, Christian friends. Today, we will be having a conversation, Shifting Sands, Coping with COVID-19. We have with us Dr. Nicole Edgecomb, clinical psychologist. Good afternoon, Dr. Edgecomb, and welcome.
Thank you.
Now, to start us off, what are the problems with COVID-19?
Well, there are lots of problems with COVID. Apart from the obvious concerns about health, COVID presents us with a condition of ongoing uncertainty in a way that is just not usual. So people are, everyone is used to a little bit of change, a little bit of uncertainty, but to have something going on for such a prolonged period of time is really a unique challenge that COVID presents us with.
Okay, so out of the problems or some of the challenges of COVID-19, does it affect our mental health?
Well, yeah, COVID, for obvious and not so obvious reasons, is extremely stressful. Even for St. Lucia, where we have done fairly well in terms of the health end of it, COVID has brought us a lot of things that we're not used to. So social distancing, the children being out of school, people losing their jobs, whole industries being shut down. All of these things are unique, they are uncomfortable, and they have an impact on our mental health because we are not used to such a prolonged experience. We don't know when it's going to end. Human beings are just not set up for that amount of uncertainty. Our brains like to cause us to think that we are always in control of our lives. That's what our mind's job is to make us think we're in control, that we handle things, that we know what's coming next. And with this situation that COVID presents us, none of that is true. And for those and a lot of other reasons, the exposure to ongoing trauma, so many people dying, so many people getting sick, none of that is normal. And especially now as we are contemplating reopening the country, and one of our preferred markets is the US, where their situation has not settled down yet. It just is an ongoing problem for us to adjust to and to feel like we have some control over.
Okay. You mentioned trauma. Before we go into the trauma part of it, what are some of the signs of mental health? How do we identify that we are mentally unhealthy?
Yeah. Well, when we think about mental health goes beyond. I know in St. Lucia we like to talk about that man crazy or those kinds of things, but any and all of us at some point in our life have challenges to our mental health. And typically it has to do with how we are coping, and specifically how we are coping in the various areas of our lives where we have to function. So when we're thinking about whether somebody is doing well mentally or not, one of the questions we would ask, or some of the questions we would ask, is about functioning in your role as a parent, functioning in your role at work or as a student, functioning in terms of your social relationships and the many tasks that you have to accomplish. Are you able to function optimally or at least adequately in all of those areas? And so when we notice that people are not functioning in any or all of those areas, we know that mentally they are not they're not doing as well as they could be.
So given that you spoke about trauma, what really is trauma?
Yeah. Trauma is is an event that overwhelms our ability to cope. It's an event in which usually there is some threat to life or possibility of injury, and there's a sense of helplessness in the situation. So we feel like there's nothing we can do to help ourselves to prevent what is happening or to be useful in any way. And so you can see that COVID very nicely fits into that picture, because every day we hear about the death, so we know it's life-threatening. Although we didn't have any deaths here in St. Lucia, people know of St. Lucians who have died, so we are not immune from the connection to the rest of the world where that is concerned. It certainly has overwhelmed a lot of us in terms of our ability to cope. So it fits the picture of something that presents us with trauma. But these days we think about trauma in a couple of different ways. So we think about big traumas. So COVID would be considered a big trauma.
Big trauma.
Right? So if we call COVID a big T trauma, those are the big things, when somebody dies, when there's an accident, where there's a hurricane. But then we all have a number of little T traumas that happen to us in the course of our lives. Okay? The daily insults, being cut off in traffic, people giving you the finger as you're driving on the road, somebody betraying your trust, or all of these are sort of little insults that we have. And what we know about trauma is that it tends to be cumulative, right? So it adds up. So if you think about this situation with trauma, with all of the uncertainty, with COVID and all of the uncertainties, it's like an ongoing build-up of at least little t's, and in some instances also the big T trauma.
So the big T causes the little t's to react.
Well, certainly in this situation, we could say that that's true.
And how do we deal with this sort of trauma? We have to look at our homes, our work, our friendship circles. How do we deal with this trauma? This trauma.
Yeah, well, and that's a good question, because how do we cope with something that's seems to be unending, or at least will be going on for several more months? And is affecting us in so many different areas, because you have your financial situation that's being affected, your work situation, your home life, children are home from school. There are so many things. How do we cope? So one thing we know in dealing with any trauma is that safety is important. Okay? So when somebody has gone through a traumatic experience, we want to ensure first and foremost that we return them to a sense of safety, that they feel more grounded, right? And for that reason, to handle that, it is important that we take seriously all of the precautions that our CMO and the World Health Organization and everybody else is telling us. Okay, PAHO, all of them are saying, wear your mask, keep an appropriate distance, sanitize your hands and surfaces. And I know that right now we are all feeling a bit more relaxed about COVID, and we all want to not wear the masks and not take the social distancing and all of the rest of that so seriously. But if we think about those people who are at high risk, people who have previously existing health conditions, people who are older, and all of the groups that we know to be at high risk, when we decide to be cavalier about the safety issues and so on, we have to take into consideration how that experience makes them feel. Right? So you and I were talking earlier about going into the supermarket and the things that we notice, right, that make us uncomfortable. And with trauma comes a lot of different symptoms, right? So hypervigilance is one of them.
So I'm hypervigilant.
Well, I don't think you're alone. Okay, I certainly notice things that I probably wouldn't notice previously more these days, right?
Yes.
So we are hypervigilant, we are hyper aroused emotionally. So tempers might flare, people might be more irritable, and so on. We know that people feel more anxious and they have more worry and stress as a result of all of that. Okay? So we also have to think about ways that we can de-stress. Okay? So if we want to cope with COVID, after we've taken care of the safety concerns, which we hope everybody will help us to take care of the safety concerns by being safe and acting in a responsible way, but then we also have to think about general health practices. Are we eating right? Are we getting enough sleep? Exercise, all of the things we know keep us healthy. We need to be doing those things with a lot more mindfulness. Before we could slack off, gain a few pounds and that. But right now it's important to really be careful about your health, because we know that with optimal health, physical health, we are more resistant to contracting the disease. Right? So that is also important. And then there are other things like relaxation, and breathing. And we don't think about those things, but it is important to focus on doing things that induce relaxation. Because even those of us who say, COVID doesn't stress me out at all, I'm not worried about it, in the background of that conscious mind experience is our unconscious experience. Okay? That is being impacted by the daily news, the nightly news, the stories we hear from others. We can't get away from it.
So binge eating and all of these things.
Right. So, and a lot of people are coping in those ways. We are eating more. We are on our phones and on our social media more. We are watching way too much of the news and, expressing our discomfort in ways that comfort us that are not necessarily good for us, right?
Okay.
So we have to think about all of those things in terms of how we're going to cope with, just making sure that I didn't leave anything out here, how we're dealing with all of those issues, right? And for some people, and I like to talk about mental hygiene. I knew I was leaving something out. So how are we coping? So one of the things too is knowing the facts. There's still rumors and inaccurate information being shared, maybe not as much as when this thing first started, but we need to stay away from things that's inaccurate and get our information from a creditable, reliable source, right?
Yes.
And then there's this issue of mental hygiene. So if you think about it, I said before, our mind's job is to protect us. That's what it wants to do. And it does that by convincing us that we are in control of situations. So you get in an airplane and your mind says, you got this, right? You don't got nothing, really. You're not in charge.
Control.
You're not flying the plane. You didn't check it out before you got in. But your mind convinces you that the pilot knows what he or she is doing, and therefore you made a good judgment to get on the plane and you're safe, right? It's only when the plane starts to go down you realize, I don't even know where the parachute is because I never listened to the flight attendant when she was giving the instructions and all of the rest of that, and we realize. So in this time of COVID, protecting our mental health by practicing what I call good mental hygiene is almost as important as practicing good physical hygiene. And what do I mean by that? Mental hygiene refers to observing what you're thinking. Okay, and people say, who does that? Yeah, but
how do you do that?
How do you do that? Well, you do it by becoming mindful, right? When you feel yourself becoming anxious, or you notice that you're worried, or you don't feel as good as you would like to feel, not as settled, pay attention to what you're thinking, and we can do it. If I were to ask you now to think about thinking, because our minds are always chatting, right? Our mind is keeping up a running commentary of useless information, useless chatter.
That's true.
It's constant. And you know how you know that? If I were to ask you right now to still your mind and stop thinking, all of a sudden you become aware that you're thinking about the groceries, what you have to cook for dinner, did you turn off the stove? Your mind just will start rolling, right? And so in the process of all of that rolling, it's thinking fearful thoughts, right? Or it's telling you things that are not safe. So when we talked earlier about our hypervigilance walking into the supermarket, seeing people who are not wearing the mask right, or in my case, I said putting away the trolley without putting it in the right place to get it sanitized. All of a sudden we're noticing those things. Would we ever notice people putting away the trolley before COVID? No. So when you catch yourself noticing the mask and you feel like you want to run out of the store, out of the supermarket, ask yourself, what am I thinking? What am I thinking? Am I thinking realistic, practical thoughts? Or am I letting myself get carried away with the fearful thoughts that say, you're not wearing your mask right, therefore I am at increased risk of getting sick and it's imminent, okay?
Yeah.
Because if we allow our minds to run away with what they're thinking, just run amok, then we are more likely actually to put ourselves at risk. We're more likely to act without thinking, to act in a rushed, impulsive way, as opposed to being thoughtful about it. Is my mask on right? That's a very important thing to think.
So
Okay.
is conditioning the mind a practice?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love how you said it. Conditioning the mind is a practice. And it is an essential practice in terms of this thing that I am calling mental hygiene. Keeping the mind clear of the clutter and the fearful thoughts, and just becoming aware, drawing yourself inwards and becoming aware of what you're allowing yourself to think. Because what we know is that in certain conditions such as anxiety and depression, people tend to have what we call ruminative thoughts. Okay? So the same thought running through your
and
mind over and over and over. So becoming aware of that. And the irony is that in cases like for anxiety, when we are worried about things, so anxiety is trying to see around corners, right?
Yeah.
So the more we allow ourselves to have those thoughts, the more we want to see around the corner, the more worried we're getting about what's happening. So it kind of feeds itself, right? And so it's very, very important that we look at what we are thinking, that we're careful about what we are allowing ourselves to think. And then when we identify that we are thinking certain thoughts that are not helpful, that are making us more depressed or more anxious or more worried or more stressed, then we need to question the thought. So I'm worried when I walk in and I see somebody not wearing their mask right. What are the chances that I'm going to contract anything from that person? So you're asking, you're speaking back to the thought. You're
Yeah.
talking to yourself in your mind. Now, come on, Nicole, what is going on here? Is it likely that I'm going to get this? What have I done to keep myself safe? And then you can reframe the thought. You can say to yourself, well, I have done the hand sanitizing.
I've done everything
I
you're
have
supposed to
kept
do.
the social distancing. My mask is on. I wear glasses, so chances are droplets not going to get into my eye. And when you begin to realize, and if you notice, by doing that, you're also imposing control. When you say, am I doing the things that I can do? There are things
Interesting
you are
enough.
in control of, right?
Yes.
So now all of a sudden you're feeling a little bit more in control,
More relaxed.
a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more calm. You can get your shopping done in a safe way because now you know you can keep yourself safe, and then you can leave and hand sanitize and sanitize everything that you bought to the extent you feel you need to, right? But if we don't do that, if we aren't careful, if we aren't observant about what we're thinking, about your finances, it's the month end, will I get paid? How am I going to feed the children? And so on and so forth. You can't even make a plan, okay? But if you keep calm and you watch what you're thinking, then you can stay organized, you can have a plan, you can seek help if you need to, and so on and so forth. And so that is one of the ways we're going to get through this, is by keeping ourselves together and taking control of what we're thinking.
You mentioned keeping yourselves together. What about, how do you say to the person who would have just lost their job? They do not have an income. They have 3 children. How do you say to that person to keep yourself together?
That is such a good question, and that is a hard one, because it's a hard one because they don't have an income, right? So the good news about COVID is, as all crises do, is that people are more altruistic. So
Yeah.
people are more likely to offer help. So if I was speaking to someone in that situation, first things first, let's start assessing who in your circle, who around you can offer you help. And if there's no one personally, are there any social service agencies or community
External.
groups or your church and so on who can offer help? Everybody is doing something for somebody, but you have to ask for help.
Ask for
People
help.
aren't going to read your mind. So the skill there is the skill of learning how to ask for help. So that's one thing. The second thing is, again, we want to impose control. What skills do you have? What are you able to do that you might be able to monetize? Do you crochet? Do you garden? Can you cut grass? Can you cook? Can you clean? How can you, and what if people were to think that way, we would come out of this COVID crisis with a lot of mini entrepreneurs who have side businesses or side jobs, because everybody is capable of doing something. right? And so, but that is what I mean about mental hygiene. If you simply sit down and you start ruminating about I don't have a job, I have these 3 children, the bananas are finished, I don't have anything else, how am I going to manage? And you just keep having that thought over and over and over, worried, then you're not allowing yourself the space to be innovative and to come up with a new plan as to how you're going to handle the situation, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not trivializing what people are going through, but I'm saying that the fearful thinking gets in the way of practical, logical thinking and appreciating that if you have these 2 things and you have this thing and it's working fairly well, we can get out of it by reaching out for help and by assessing accurately what our gifts are. And we all have gifts.
Dr. Edgecomb, thank you so much for going through with us how we start shifting the sands.
Yes.
And how we cope with COVID-19. And I hope that in the coming weeks we can have another conversation.
I would love to.
Thank you
Okay,
so
thank
much
you.
for viewing. Good afternoon.
Short and sweet. Thank you. That was
I
good.
am roasting.
You're very good at that. You see, you have another skill.